Hi, my name is Terry Keating, Bonzoleum on YouTube. This is Musicians on the Record with David Ward. Hit it.
Welcome to Musicians on the Record. I'm David Ward. You've heard the music, now hear their story. We are talking all about John Henry Bonham, Bonzo, today on the show with Terry Keating of Bonzoleum on the YouTube channel. Did I get that right, Terry?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
That's right.
Yeah. Terry Keating, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I definitely want to get into all kinds of things, John Bonham, today. But let's start with your story, because that's who we're interviewing. Tell me a little bit about how did music start for you?
Well, years and years ago, I used to listen to, my dad we had the hi-fi set up back in the day. And, he had one of the early cassette machines and stuff. And so I'd always go out and I'd listen to Elton John and, all kinds of older Beatles and stuff. And one day my brother had he'd just gone out and bought The Song Remains the Same on vinyl, passing around with the stereo. And No Quarter came on, the 1973 No Quarter. Yeah. And I remember just loving the way the song sounded. Yeah. Jimmy Page's solo and how the cymbals sounded and the drums sounded. And that was sort of the beginning of my Led Zeppelin fetish, which is in its, 39th year.
Yeah. And so how old were you about?
I was about probably 9 at the time, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. And what was it about Zeppelin and Bonham's playing per se that really caught you?
I don't know. At the time, I didn't know. I was a young kid. It just was it was a heavy sound without it sounding like processed heavy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it sounded like I can't explain it really. Like when I'd listen to other stuff later, like Black Sabbath or Iron Maiden and stuff, it didn't quite have the same sound. So obviously I fell in love with the Zeppelin tunes first.
Yeah.
But then also just the way, for me, it was always really a lot of how it sounded. Yeah. It's just, I think for a lot of Zeppelinites, and the world's chock full of them, I don't think that they really can even quantify it. There's just a way, it's a couple different variables. It's the song, but it's also the way it sounds in general. But it's also the way John Bonham approached the drums, at least for the drummers anyway.
Absolutely.
It's mystery trinity of qualities.
Yes. Well, and the way Jimmy Page produced it and really put the drums really in the forefront as well, as opposed to many bands who drums were really recorded in the background.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So when did you actually start playing drums, Terry?
Well, I had early on in 1978, I went to a Catholic grade school, and they had a band program.
Okay.
So I had, they're like, well, you got to do that.
Yeah.
So I then joined, and, at the time, with drums now, acrolytes, I don't have anyone sitting here, but, back in the day when I was in band, we had, if you had a snare drum that was only 9 years old, it was a Keystone badge acrolite. It was sort of modern. It was sort of then was now. It was like the, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Nothing was vintage then unless you had a 1940s snare drum.
Right.
So I did that for about 2 or 3 months, and I hated having to sit there, and we really didn't do rudiments or anything. It was just like sort of like Ted Reed's kind of syncopation stuff, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I made it up until Christmas when we had a Christmas show. There were like 12 of us with our snare drum set up on stage, and for the school in the daytime, we marred this performance. Everybody was totally off. And my music teacher back in those days, they'd have a ruler. She essentially said, "Listen, if you don't hit it tonight, it's your ass." More or less, she said. We were all scared to death.
Yeah.
Went up 4 hours later. The parents came. It was like 7 o'clock at night in the gym. By the grace of God, we all nailed it.
Wow.
And about a week after that, I'm like, I don't want to.
Yeah.
So then came about 4 years later. I had a friend named Darren, great guitar player, who played the drums too. Who was really, really good. He said, "I have some drums if you ever want to come over and play." I'm like, "That's great." So I went over, and Darren had a snare drum, a floor tom, and 2 rack toms that were sort of loosely mounted on a hi-hat stand. Mm-hmm. No bass drum. Mm-hmm. So what I did was I took a towel and I put it over my floor tom, and I'd play like this. I'd play that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you think I'd have a lot better left hand, but I don't.
Yeah.
So I did that for about 6 or 8 months, till one day Darren came over walking up the driveway holding a bass drum that he found in the garbage.
Wow.
It was the same color. It was red sparkle.
Oh, man.
I think the drums were Whitehall. And the bass drum wasn't a Whitehall, but it fit right in. So then I had a bass drum.
Yes.
About 6 months I had that. Eventually Darren had to sell the drums. I was drumless. I went on, I found this is probably why I have my drum hoarding fetish, because back in 1983, in like September of 1983, I found a drum set there was a thing called Trading Times, which was like the local paper where people were selling gear.
Yep.
And in those days, in 1983, Yamaha and Tama and everybody in Pearl had come in and sort of taken over the market. And all these folks were totally getting rid of their Ludwigs, their Rogers, their Slingerlands, Cam, everything.
Yeah.
So I, having the luck that I have, and I'm kind of a stoop, found a Ludwig set. My brother and I went there. It was $350.
Wow.
After I was so eager to take it, I didn't realize it was an old Japanese set that the finish had been taken off and painted black with a Ludwig head on the front. So I gave this guy $350 for a 5-piece kit, which even today would be worth $40.
You bet.
So I got totally shafted on my own volition. And then that's why I think ever since then I've been trying to get good deals on drum sets to try to somehow make up for the malfunction I had back, what is now almost 34 years ago.
How many drums would you guess you have overall?
Well, I have less. Well, what happened was I first got into a lot of the drums by collecting, but I kind of stumbled into collecting. Like in the 90s is when vintage drums kind of started getting beyond sort of a small group of people. Right. So what happened is I had, in the early mid 90s, maybe 94, I had that black painted set till about 1987 or 8. I found a used Pearl Export, which again the magic number was 350. In those days I probably got hosed too. Played it for about 3 or 4 years, and I was like, God, I want to find myself like an old set of drums, like an old sparkly. So I was looking again in the Trading Times. This is about a decade later. This is before online now, Craigslist and everything.
Yeah.
So I found it was a Ludwig 4-piece. She said old pearloid finish with cymbals, and it said again the magic number again was 350. So at this point I had my own car. I was 23 or 4 at the time. Got in, drove out about maybe a half hour. I'm in Chicago, so one of the further west suburbs. Yeah. Went out, and I remember her name. Her name was Josephine, and her last name was Alonji, Josephine Alonji. I remember her. This is almost 24 years ago.
Wow.
And her husband had died about a year or two before. He was a drummer in Chicago. I mean, he, a lot of drummers way back in the day playing like Mr. Kelly's and all kinds of other places. Every place had a house band.
Sure.
So he had a set 22, 13, 16 Ludwig. He'd be like a 1965 Blue Oyster Pearl. With a couple old Formula 602s, nice 15-inch pair of Zildjians from like the 50s.
Yeah.
I remember a 16-inch old, what they call a transition stamp Zildjian. And so I gave her the 350 that I had, and I felt so bad. I mean, I knew the stuff was worth so much more than that. So I said to her, well, listen, when I get home, I'm going to give you, because I knew the stuff was kind of worth money. So I said, I'm going to send you some more money. So I went home. I kind of found out how much everything was worth. I sent her another few $100 via check. So she sent me a really nice card later. So I then kind of got into collecting. I was kind of like, wow, there's a lot of old drums out there.
Yeah.
So, but that I always felt bad. So often you go to people's houses. Like here in Chicago, you have the north side and the south side, right? The west side, and I noticed a lot of the more blue-collar folks, like the dads who were plumbers or firemen, police, they bought their kids really good, expensive stuff. When you went to the really fancy, like Northbrook sort of river foresty locations, a lot of the wealthier people bought their kids garbage. It's just funny the way that worked.
Yeah.
You go to somebody's house, and there'd be an older guy or a couple, and they'd be like, yeah, it's $200 too much. And I think to myself, like, God, there's like $1,000 worth of stuff.
Right.
So I just as much as I could. I tell them, of course, that I was going to sell some stuff, but it might take me 3 months. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In those days, you had to put stuff in what was called like Larry Levy's The Sheet or whatever. I mean, it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
So then eventually that sort of germinated into my hoarding illness. I went from that 22, 13, 16, which, by the way, I swear to God, this is the truth. I sold that 22, 13, 16. He gave me like $700 for them.
Okay. Wow.
He sold them to Oasis. So I got the $700 and 2 tickets to the show down at the Aragon Ballroom.
Sweet.
I went down there, the backstage, I couldn't get backstage. My boss's daughter was there. She was like 16 at the time. She's like, "Oh, you're going backstage?" I'm like, "No." The last thing I needed was her to go backstage.
Right.
And me to be found dead in the back of the car somewhere because the daughter was kidnapped.
Right.
Anyway, so so stuff like that happened a lot. And there was another time that I came across a set of Gretsch, old 50s Gretsch, 22, 13, 16 with the matching snare in what they call peacock sparkle. It was like champagne sparkle, but it had little green, blue, and red flecks in it.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I bought that, and I sold it. I had it in a window in Forest Park. My boss had a building in Forest Park, right here in Chicago, this town. And I put them in the window, because, again, it was before the internet, right?
Yeah, right.
Not sure what the hell to do with them.
Right.
So I put them in the window, and there was a screen, like sun can kill these things, but they had one of these black, things that I could get down where you could still see through, but I was hoping it would protect from the sun. Yeah. Anyway, I got a call from this guy, and he talked like this. He's like, I had a little sign there, drums for sale, $800, and my phone number,
Yeah.
I'm interested in the drums, can I come see him? So I met him over there, and this guy comes over, and he's all scraggly, and his hands are all yellow from smoking. He's got a beard that's all scraggly. He's like, I want to buy him. I'm like, okay. I'm like, all right. I'm like, they're $800. He's like, okay. He pulls his wallet out, and in his wallet is a stack of crisp 50s, 50s or 100s, but like right from the bank.
Yeah.
Pays me right there. Carry him down the street about 2 blocks to his apartment, which is above a storefront, which I almost rented later to put a drum store in.
Wow.
And it turned out his name was Eddie Ho. And he was a drummer. He played for, he had a lot of studio stuff out on the West Coast, like Donovan and Mamas and the Papas and stuff.
Okay.
Anyway, I think his brand sort of went south in the late 60s, early 70s.
I see.
And, but he ended up buying those drums from me.
Wow. Very cool.
So, yeah, I have stories like that.
Yeah, yeah. And so for the main kit that you have, at least that you have set up right there, Terry, for the YouTube videos and all of the Bonzo music, can you take us through a little bit of what you have? And you might have to turn the camera angle a little bit. Could you show us what you have and describe your gear here?
Well, what I have here, let me start with this snare drum. To me, I really love, Ludwig aluminum snare drums. There's a certain sound to them. But as of late, I kind of just play whatever I just grab. Okay. So right here, what I have been using, well, actually, I should say a few of the drums that I have been playing for a long time, I've been selling stuff on eBay just because I need to clear so much of this out. And I'm really, you could make a hoarders episode. Okay. You really could. It's embarrassing. I've just been selling a lot of stuff. But right now, I have this drum on. It's a Drumcraft. It's a company that they say they're German engineered, but they're made in China, for the labor and stuff. And the drum kit I have here is a Premier. It's a Janista. Again, it's an import Janista. Which I had found, pretty cheap on the internet at the time. They were selling them out.
That's beautiful.
Well, it's a lot of the drums I have these days are those types of drums. And when I said before about the I'm not kidding about buying more drums and more drums and more drums to kind of, I think, subconsciously make up for this time I got ripped off in 1980. That's serious. I think it's really like a crazy, Maslow psychological thing.
Right.
So I don't know. But yeah, so this is essentially just, anything that I have, I'll just sort of set up and play. I really don't have a favorite drum, really. I always like to have a Ludwig Superphonic around because I like the sound of them. Yeah. I do like Paiste cymbals. I do like Zildjians and say I just like a cymbal that sounds good. Yeah. But I do really like, again, when I had first heard Zeppelin, one of the things, like I said in that No Quarter, was the sound of the cymbals. I'd heard all kinds of Beatles, and I'd heard all kinds of, the Byrds, and I'd heard all kinds of, Elton John, and all kinds of other ABBA. My folks listen to ABBA. And There was just something about the sound of the drums and the cymbals in the song. I mean, it's the same thing.
Yes.
I remember seeing a picture in the album. Remember when you opened it out?
Yep.
Bonham, there was a symbol in the picture a little. Like one of the pictures of it, he's there and you can see a light behind him. And you can see Paiste. And I'd never heard that before. I'd always heard Zildjian at the time. Sabian wasn't around yet. So when I went, I was like, I'm gonna get those cymbals because that's what it sounded like.
Yes.
You know,
giant beats, right?
Well, yeah. Well, at the time, by then he was playing 2002s.
Yes.
Another thing too. I can tell you my whole giant beat story too. But
go for it.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Well, it's funny. What I started to do. I mean, I come across as wacky in the videos. I know I do. I don't mean to, because I'm a little. I'm just a little wacky. You know.
That's what I like about you, Terry.
But what happened? Well, it's funny because sometimes people like it, and other times people are like, like this police song, "Don't Stand So Close to Me." You know what I mean? But so what happened is, honest to God, in the mid '90s, I remember there was a book I found. I forget who wrote it, Richie York or somebody, but it was an early Zeppelin book. And late 80s, I think I first read it. I think it was one that had the Pez candy on it. Maybe it was a Richie York book or something. But it mentioned, in Paiste, had these cymbals called giant beats. Now, at that time, I was familiar with Paiste, the current offerings, which at the time, where they just come out with the 1000s, the 2000s, and the 3000s. Okay. But they got rid of the 2002. I don't know if you know that. For like a year and a half, they got rid of the 2002. They pulled a Coke Classic.
Okay.
And a bunch of, I think, German... like, listen, if you guys don't start making these 2002, we're going to burn your German factory here.
Right.
So they did. They started making them again. But I remember, like, giant beats. And I remember thinking, like, it was such a funny term. Like, it was so 60s, like, giant beat. You know, it was like the beat. Like, I remember, like, teen beat and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I could never find any. Like, because at the time, like, all the Paiste symbols at the time, they were ink stamped. And even in the stamp they had on them, it would often say in the embossed stamp, it would say the model, like 2002, it would say up until like maybe 1980, it would say that.
Yeah.
And I never could find any giant beats. But the funny thing, I realized later I had found some giant beats, but I realized later they were giant beats. But at the time, I didn't realize they were because it just said Paiste on the symbol.
Wow.
It looked very similar to the old Ludwig Standard logo.
Okay.
Except that if you took Ludwig Standard and pulled it out, that's pretty much what the giant beat stamp looked like,
Yeah.
So I had come across them. I just didn't realize they were giant. So I called Paiste in like 90, I don't know, a long time ago.
Okay.
And I called them out in California and I said, hey, you guys used to have a symbol called the giant beats. Do you guys know what those, were about? And the lady cut me off. She's like, giant beat? She's like a big red beat?
Right.
Like kind of poking fun, or not even kind of.
Right.
No, like a symbol,
Right.
So some time went by, and then at that time what I started to do was I used to work at a high school, and I remember there's a fellow that plays in town here who's a really good musician. Not Lonnie, God, what is his name? Anyway, he worked at the high school with me there, and he'd get one of the rooms, and he'd just sneak in at night and rehearse his band.
Okay.
So I was outside in the football field, cleaning some stuff up. It was, and coming from this window was the band playing, and the sound of this cymbal, I was like, oh my God, that's the sound of 1973 No Quarter.
Right.
I went booking in there, went running up, came in the room, the guys are jamming. I literally walked right up to the guy's drums. They were kind of like, can I help you?
Right.
Crash you playing there? He's like, this one. It was a Paiste 505 18-inch crash. Like, thanks a lot. All I need. Sorry, carry on. Got the hell out of there.
Yeah.
So this might have been 90. Well, this would have been 91 or 2 for this particular juncture. So I couldn't find any 505s at that point. Had been just continuing probably for about 5. So I was sort of on the hunt for them. Remember, there was no internet. It was a trading time. So eventually, what I did is I'd call up Paiste and be like, "Listen, do you guys have any?" And say, well, and this is what bothered me, because a few years ago they came out with all these symbols they found in the vault.
Yeah.
Like 20 years ago when I asked about them, they said they didn't have any, So, but anyway, so I'd call Paiste and say, hey, what about the giant beats? Or when they were discontinuing the 602s, in those days even now you can't order anything direct through Paiste. You had to find a store to get them through. There was an outfit called Thoroughbred Music, So I would call Paiste and say, well, listen, I'll buy them through Thoroughbred Music. So at the time, they had just discontinued, or they were discontinuing this. Well, they'd stopped making the 602s, but they had some left in the vault. These they told me they had. So I bought a few pairs of hats. And like the last Sound Edge top they had, Blue Label, I got it.
Wow.
But the discontinued cymbals in those days, they'd give you for like half price.
Oh.
It was pretty neat. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember getting 3 pair of Paiste 2000 Sound Reflection Sound Edge hats, 15 inch, each for like $120.
Wow.
And then being devastated that they were so heavy when they came. Right. They were like not at all like the 2002 Sound Edge hats. Anyway, so then I called, when Zildjian came out with I don't know what happened. I thought that the Sound Edge patent would have run out earlier, but then Zildjian had the master sounds, and Sabian does the accelerator. They started doing the Paiste sound wave thing.
Yeah.
And I'd call them and say, hey, great cymbals, but the original Sound Edge that Paiste did, it was a really thin cymbal, and the ones that these guys were sort of like sewer caps. And of course, every time I call, they'd be like, all right, buddy, thanks a lot. So I would call these companies like unsolicitedly, just because I'm all wacky. Don't stand so close to me.
Yeah.
Like Ludwig in the early 90s, and I'm like, how come, and I had this catalog, I'm like, how come you have all these 80s drums still on here? And, vintage is getting big, and, why do you say your Superphonics are still all metal? They're aluminum. Just say that, this kind of. And so now I have this rep, I think, as like this, obviously this, like there's something wrong with this fella. Maybe some of his ideas might be good.
Right.
Rub up. Anyway, so as far as all the drums go down here, again, by now, all the vintage stuff is long gone. The last thing I got rid of in the vintage department, I used to have all kinds of old Avitas Zildjians. And this was back in the day before a lot of people really knew a lot about the old cymbals.
Yeah.
And at that time, the only thing to know was how they looked, how old they looked.
Right, yeah.
I got pretty good at, picking them up pretty cheap, because I could just by looking at a picture of it, like on the early days of eBay, I could just tell it was an old one.
Yeah.
Anyway, but now everybody and their brother is all familiar with the Avitas Zildjian and Paiste Giant Beats.
Yes.
Anyway, but yeah, so but eventually what happened was with the YouTube channel is I had realized, like, I would look up and I'd see like I remember watching the Steve Smith video about the Fool in the Rain. And Steve Smith is a monster drummer.
He is.
And he loves drums so much, he's so dedicated to it, and all he does is try to make himself better. He's like a great role model for people to aspire to if you want to get good at anything.
Yes, agreed.
But he's like, well, here's Fool in the Rain. He started playing it, but it was like how a jazz person would play it.
Yeah.
A lot more complicated.
Yes.
The feel is different. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's not really accurate. I mean, it's harder than what Bonham was playing.
Yeah.
It's more difficult to do what he was doing, but it's not what he was playing, So that's pretty much it, so everything mostly here now I have are modern drums that I bought, honestly, to try to quell this sinister hoarding disorder I have, which I now have to just stop. So I'm selling. I did keep a bunch of Ludwig snares, like Ludwig Acrolites and a few Supras and stuff that I've been selling off, and I just need to really declutter, down here. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So, in more ways than one, not just to make room, but also, appease the wife.
I understand. Yeah.
Clear my brain out of all this crazy hoarding, and it's common. A lot of drummers, I know guitar players have 11 guitars.
Right.
I was looking at one of the drum sites today. Somebody has like 23 pairs of hi-hats. You know what I mean? I'm like, well, at least I'm not alone. What I did was I'm like, I'm going to make a video, I think, and put it on YouTube. So I had this camera, like a little Vizio camera. So the first 3 videos I made were me playing the intro to rock and roll.
Wow.
A little bit of Poor Tom, and then 6 bars of Fool in the Rain.
Yeah.
So, and I put those up, and people seemed to like them. And then I'm like, well, let me bring the camera downstairs, and I brought it down here, and I started making videos, and the sound was real bad for years and years and years. And people still seemed to like them. So eventually, like last year, I got this pretty nice camera. I got a Nikon 35 millimeter with a mic input, and I have a little board here, like a little Mackie board, and I feed it in. And I pretty much just use this one condenser mic. It's an MX LV250, and it seems to work really well.
Sounds great.
Well, so yeah, it's. I mean, I the thing is that I have my opinions on what it seems to me that a lot of drummers do. I mean, even apart from Bonham, like engineers, is they start with the closed mic, and then it's almost, well, maybe not these days because things have gone back to sort of more the organic, but 20 years ago, they'd be like, well, let's put a microphone on everything. Even, they'd have 421 on top of the tom, a 57 on the bottom. They'd have like two mics on each tom.
Right.
You'd have, some guys would put like an SM81 and then also a little lavalier mic in the hat, but it'd all be closed mic,
Yeah.
But it's like, well, if you put your ear right here, well, of course you can have little rings and stuff, and so it just makes sense that back in the day. I mean, all right, let's put it this way. This is the analogy I have. You close mic everything, just specific. I mean, if you're going for that sound, if you have a song you want to record and it fits the sound, that's great. But in general, it's almost like having somebody with an electric guitar and putting an SM57 2 inches from where they're going to be picking it.
Right.
And then putting the effects on that. Well, the theater of it is the electrical signal being picked up actually by the pickups, going through whatever boxes or effects they want. That's the theater in which it occurs.
Yes.
Drums, kind of the room it's in, or the surrounding it's in, is sort of like its amplifier and its effects pedal.
Absolutely.
It is, and so I think, and that was obviously one of the things about the Bonham sound. Like when I record, I'm going to record another record. And I like a more open sound. I don't necessarily want the Bonham sound, but I do want a more open sound. Like it is nice to have the room sound, but not too roomy. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, so what I find here is this mic placement I have here essentially, because to me the drums always sound the best from where you're sitting.
Yeah.
Because you have the sound waves come back at you.
Yeah.
Literally, the cymbals are coming back here. The snare's coming up. So I put the microphone. Essentially, it's about a foot behind my head. I don't have to worry about any phase issues just because there's one microphone.
So essentially what you're saying is that your show really was inspired by Steve Smith's advanced jazz techniques, because he is more of a jazz drummer who then played rock in Journey. He doesn't know it, but thank you, Steve Smith, for inspiring your show.
Well, but it's not just Steve, a lot of other guys. But that's just kind of how they'd I mean, again, there's a lot of things you could think of. Maybe that day he was making the video, he made it a little more. But one thing I notice about people's, the way they play, especially if they're not like Juilliard or Berkeley trained, they learn kind of through lessons and stuff. But then when they go off on their own, they play things. Eventually, they'll play things that are technically, they play them improperly. But if you consistently play something wrong or with a slight weird accent on it or a weird little sort of feel to it, but you consistently do that over and over again, that's what your style is.
Right.
Like nowadays, everything now is like extreme, right? There's like extreme baking shows and extreme parachuting and extreme, mortuaries and stuff.
Right.
Well, it also has, now obviously it's with guitars and drums too. You see a lot of these young kids with the drums that have unbelievable technique.
Yes.
They're all used to playing really since especially the late 80s, like when rap was coming in and stuff really started to get in sequenced and drum machined.
Yes.
So many people now are so absolutely used to perfect time that, a lot of the drummers these days that I see are so used to playing to sequencers or to clicks, and their technique is so good that I find they all, in a certain way, all sound alike. I mean, literally, the notes they play, the fills they do, the way they string together, like the quins with the bass drums and everything.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong, that stuff is, it's a bitch to play.
Sure.
And if I was never much of I never really wanted to be. I used to practice double bass just to get my left foot into it. But I never really liked the way, short of like a good dugga, I never really liked the way a double bass kind of snuck in. It somehow made it sound, to me, and I'll probably get slammed for this, but made it sound somehow cheesy in a weird way. But that's just from my point of view.
Sure.